The keycard printer jammed again at exactly 2:47 a.m. That was the third time that winter, always the same hour, always that grinding click like it didn't want to spit the card out. Len was downstairs doing rounds, and I was alone at the front desk. Snow tapped gently against the windows in that soft, constant way that made it easy to forget how cold it really was outside. And then I heard the lobby door open. No footsteps, no voice, just that soft chime, and then silence. When I looked up, a man was already standing at the counter, coat soaked, hood up, not moving. He didn't blink when I greeted him. He just placed a room key on the desk, one of ours, and whispered, "Not until 2:47. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel quite right. And if these stories help keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one." My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working nights at a quiet lodge near the western slope of the Rockies. Not a ski resort, just a mid-range place tucked into the trees where snow came early and stuck around too long. The kind of place where families stayed during the holidays and hikers came through in the off-season looking for something cheap and clean. I'd taken the night shift the winter my sister moved out of state. I needed something steady, something quiet. And it was. At first. The lodge was old, not falling apart, just built with that creaky kind of charm that tourists liked and staff eventually stopped noticing. The lobby had one gas fireplace, two mismatched armchairs, and a snack machine that never quite lit up right. I worked alone most nights with Len doing rounds checking boiler pressure, clearing snow from the emergency exits, keeping the old pipes from freezing solid. Len was in his late 40s, dependable in a kind of weary way. He never said much unless something needed fixing. I liked that about him. The week before Christmas, a heavy snow rolled in fast, thick, wet flakes that blanketed the mountain roads by nightfall. By 9 p.m., we'd already turned away 3 stranded travelers. Every room was booked. That's why it stood out when the man walked in after midnight and dropped a key on the counter. I hadn't heard the bell chime. I hadn't even heard the front door open. Just the click of that key as it landed in front of me. He wore a gray parka with the hood still up and gloves so dark they looked wet. He didn't speak at first, just stared. I looked down at the key. Room 217. Except we didn't have a 217. We only had 16 rooms, 8 on each side. Room 216 was the last. "You must be in the wrong place," I said, trying to keep my voice even. But he didn't respond, just turned and walked away, not toward the rooms, but toward the hallway that led to the old conference wing, a wing that had been closed off since the 90s. I should have radioed Len. I should have done a lot of things. But instead, I picked up the key and turned it over in my hand. It had the same logo, same weight, same dull metal tag. Only the number didn't make sense. I checked the logbook. No check-ins after 11 uur, no gaps, no early arrivals. And yet that key was real. I walked around the counter and looked down the hall where the man had gone. The carpet back there was older, faded from years of sun. The motion lights didn't come on. I stood there for a while, just listening. But the hallway swallowed sound, like it always had. By the time Len came back from rounds, the snow was still falling steady. He stomped off his boots near the service entrance and grunted, "Boilers running rough." I told him about the man, the key, the wrong room number. He raised an eyebrow but didn't say much. Just took the key, flipped it twice in his hand and said, "This is one of the old ones, from before the remodel." Then he looked at me more serious. "Where's the guy now?" I didn't have an answer. Len grabbed his flashlight and went to check the hallway. I stayed at the desk, trying not to watch the clock. 2:33, 2:38, 2:41. Then the keycard printer jammed. It was that same sound again, mechanical, stubborn, trying to spit out a card I hadn't sent. I opened the panel thinking it was just dust, but the screen flashed a single message, processing room 217. I froze. That room didn't exist in our system. I unplugged the machine. At 2:47 a.m., exactly the lobby phone rang once. No caller ID. I picked it up, said hello. All I heard was breathing, not loud, not threatening, just slow, steady breathing. Then click. Len came back 10 minutes later. He said the hallway was empty, but one of the old doors at the end, the one with the peeling number plate, had been cracked open. No light inside. Just cold air spilling out like the heat had never been turned on. I asked if he closed it. He shook his head. "Slammed it," he said, then held up the old key. "Put this back wherever you found it." I did. I locked it in the bottom drawer and didn't tell management. No one ever asked about it. No one ever claimed it. A week later, a guest checked out early from room 215, saying they heard footsteps pacing above them all night. There's no second floor above room 215. Just roof and snow. I still have that key. Room 217. The numbers are worn almost smooth, like someone ran their thumb over them again and again. I keep it in a drawer with my old name tag and a few photos from that winter. I don't work there anymore, but some nights around 2:47, I'll wake up without reason and feel like I've just missed something. Something quiet, something deliberate. I don't usually talk about it mostly because it still feels like something I imagined, like maybe I dreamed it all and just never quite shook the feeling. But I know it was real. I remember the cold metal of the doorknob, the silence behind it, and the weight of my phone in my hand while I listened for footsteps that never came. That kind of fear settles in your muscles. It lingers long after the moment passes. In the spring of 2019, I was renting one half of a duplex just outside Dayton, Ohio. It was a quiet little street, one of those in-between neighborhoods that wasn't quite city and not exactly suburban either. I'd taken a contract job at a logistics firm, and the location was convenient. The place was nothing fancy, but the rent was cheap and the neighbor in the other unit was rarely home. Most nights I had the whole building to myself. That Saturday started like most others. I was 2 cups of coffee in and lazily alternating between folding laundry and half watching a rerun of a cooking show I didn't even like. It was the kind of weekend afternoon that felt like it could stretch forever, quiet, uneventful, forgettable. I had the living room window cracked open just enough to let the breeze in. That's when I saw him. There was a man across the street, walking slowly along the sidewalk in front of the vacant lot. At first I thought he might be waiting for someone, or maybe just pacing while talking on the phone. But he wasn't on the phone. He wasn't really doing anything. He just walked back and forth in this tight little loop, glancing up at my unit every few seconds like he was trying to decide something. He wore a baggy denim jacket and kept one hand tucked into his pocket, the other holding something I couldn't quite make out from that distance. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he lived nearby. But the moment I stepped out onto the porch to shake out a rug, he stopped cold, like I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared. I gave a short nod and muttered a polite "morning" before going back inside, but the interaction stuck with me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Maybe 2 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. It wasn't loud, more like a hesitant tapping. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The kind of knock someone makes when they're not sure if they're supposed to be there. I opened the door just wide enough to see him again standing on the bottom step. He looked up at me with a blank expression, like he was trying to remember something. His voice was calm but flat distant. "Hey," he said. "Did a woman named Janine ever live here? Or maybe Jennifer?" I told him. I'd only been renting the place for a month, didn't know the previous tenants. He nodded slowly, but didn't leave. Instead, he looked past me into the house like he was searching for something or someone specific. Then he said, "Right." Okay, turned and walked around the corner of the duplex. That should have been it. Just a weird guy asking about someone who didn't live there. But I didn't like that he went around to the side of the house where the laundry room entrance was. I waited by the front window, trying to look casual, pretending to check my phone while I peeked through the blinds. After a minute or two, he was gone. At least I assumed he was. I didn't see him leave, and I didn't hear anything. But something about the way he'd said those names stuck with me, like he wasn't really asking, just seeing if one would trigger a response, like he was casting a net. I locked the front door, double-checked the deadbolt, then wedged a chair under the knob the way my dad used to do when we stayed at cheap motels on road trips. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I kept the TV volume low, subconsciously listening for anything unusual. About 20 minutes passed. I was in the kitchen rinsing a pan when I heard a dull, metallic scraping sound like something prying against metal. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor working on their car. But when I moved toward the back of the house, I caught a glimpse through the small side window by the laundry room. He was back. This time, he wasn't pacing. He was crouched low by the side door, shoulders hunched, working a tire iron into the frame just below the lock. There was no urgency in the way he moved. He wasn't panicking, wasn't looking around. It was methodical, like someone performing a routine they'd practiced many times before. For a few seconds, I just stood there frozen, watching him. Then instinct took over. I backed away from this window as quietly as I could, grabbed my phone from the coffee table, and locked myself in the downstairs bathroom, the only room in the house without a window, and the only door with a sliding bolt. I sat down on the tile floor, knees tucked to my chest, trying not to breathe too loudly, while I dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up almost immediately. I gave her my address, whispered what was happening, and she stayed on the line with me, asking quiet questions, while I strained to hear anything outside the bathroom. Then came the sound. I'll never forget the sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by a pause. Not footsteps, not shouting, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like the house is listening too. After what felt like a full minute, I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps across the kitchen tile. Heel, toe, Pause. Heel. Toe. They moved toward the hallway, toward me. He didn't try the doorknob, didn't speak, but I heard the faint brush of fingers along the doorframe, like someone feeling for weakness. Then nothing. I stayed completely still, gripping the phone like a lifeline, every muscle locked in place. The dispatcher whispered that officers were nearby and told me not to move unless I heard them call out. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then a voice, muffled but clear, called from outside. "Police, if anyone's inside." Call out, I bolted up, unlocked the bolt, and flung the door open. The hallway was empty. 2 officers met me at the front of the duplex. They'd found the side door ajar, pried open near the latch, but the intruder was gone. No signs of forced entry beyond the side. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. When I described the man, denim jacket, shaved head, pale skin, deep circles under his eyes. One of the officers nodded. "We've had a few calls about someone like that," he said. "This is the first time he's actually gone inside." They took my statement and told me to call again if I saw him. I spent the next 3 nights sleeping on the couch with every light in the house turned on and a kitchen knife tucked under the blanket. I had a friend come stay over for a while after that, but the man never came back. Still, I replaced the lock on the side door, added motion lights, and eventually moved out 3 months later. To this day, I still wonder who he was, who Janine or Jennifer might have been if they were even real. But what stays with me more than anything is how calm he was. Like walking into someone's house with a tire iron was no big deal. Like maybe in his mind he belonged there. I've always been cautious, but that day made me question what cautious even means. It wasn't the middle of the night. It wasn't a strange part of town. It was 1:30 in the afternoon in my own apartment with the sun shining outside. And I still almost opened the door. At the time, I lived alone in a 3rd-floor unit just outside Phoenix. It was one of those massive beige apartment complexes where every building looked identical, and you could hear your neighbors sneeze through the vents. I'd been working from home for about 7 months, handling payroll and scheduling for a medical group downtown. My days were predictable Zoom calls, leftover lunches, laundry on Wednesdays, and the occasional walk to the mailbox if I remembered before it got dark. It wasn't exciting, but I liked the solitude. That afternoon had been quiet. The sun was out, but the blinds were drawn, and the apartment had that still slightly stale feeling it always got when the AC wasn't running. I'd just finished a virtual meeting and was reheating pasta in the microwave when there was a knock at the door. Not the buzzer, just 3 deliberate knocks, slow, even, like someone making sure I heard them. I froze. Nobody ever came to my place without texting first. Not the few friends I had in town, not my neighbors, and definitely not property staff. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing there. He looked to be late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a navy polo with a small patch on the chest I couldn't read from that angle. He had a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. His sunglasses were pushed up onto his head, and he looked just slightly impatient, like someone waiting for a signature they didn't really want to chase down. He must have noticed the shadow behind the door, because he raised his voice a little. "Hi, ma'am, I'm with maintenance. We had a leak in one of the lower units. We're doing quick checks on all the water heaters." His tone was casual, like he'd already said it 5 times that day. He pointed at the clipboard with his pen. "Should only take a minute." I didn't open the door. Instead, I spoke through it. "Do you have ID from the leasing office?" He hesitated, just slightly. Then his face changed. The smile flattened. His eyebrows drew down a little. "Ma'am," he said, this time a little more clipped, "it's just a water heater check." There was no aggression in his voice, but there was something else. Pressure. I stayed still. He added, "Just open the door so I can get this done." It wasn't a yell. It wasn't loud, but it was the tone that made my stomach tighten, like I was the problem now. I told him again that I wasn't comfortable letting anyone in without confirmation from the front office. He didn't argue. Just stood there for a few seconds longer, then muttered something under his breath and walked away. Not fast, not frustrated, just gone. I waited behind the door for another minute before backing away. Locked the deadbolt, slid the security bar across for the first time since moving in. My hands were shaking a little, not from fear, exactly more like adrenaline catching up with whatever my brain had just processed. I immediately called the leasing office, but it was around lunch and no one answered. I left a voicemail, then followed it up with an email, just so I'd have it in writing. The rest of the afternoon dragged. I kept pacing back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, peeking through the blinds whenever I heard a door close or footsteps outside. The parking lot looked normal. The hallway stayed quiet, but I couldn't relax. Around 4 o'clock, Lisa, the property manager, finally called me back. I'd spoken to her once or twice before, and she always sounded like someone juggling 5 tasks while answering your question. I explained what had happened, and when I finished, she asked me to describe the guy. Shirt, hair, clipboard, everything. I gave as much detail as I could, and then she got quiet. "We didn't have any maintenance requests in your building today," she said, "and none of our team matched that description." My stomach dropped. She asked if I could come to the office in the morning to look at some security footage. I said yes. That night I barely slept. I turned the hallway light on and left it there, checked the locks 3 times. Even dragged a chair partway in front of the door, something I hadn't done since college. It felt like overkill, but I couldn't stop thinking about how confident he'd been. Not aggressive, not strange, just practiced. The next morning, I walked to the leasing office just after they opened. Lisa was already there, standing beside one of the maintenance guys, Kenny, I think his name was. Short guy, wore a baseball cap, and spoke maybe 10 words total. Lisa didn't say much. She just waved me over and pointed at the screen. "You're not the only one," she said. She hit play, and there he was. Same man, same shirt, same clipboard, walking up to another unit across the courtyard. He knocked, stood there, waited, then moved on. Lisa scrubbed through the footage and showed me 3 more attempts, all in the same building. All units rented by women who lived alone. None of them had filed maintenance requests. None of them let him in. One of them had cracked the door open, she said, but shut it again when she got a weird feeling. He hadn't forced anything, hadn't damaged property, just tried, which somehow made it worse. He knew exactly what he was doing, how to dress, how to talk, how long to linger. Enough to be believable, but not long enough to get caught. Lisa said they'd reported it to the police earlier that morning after one of the other tenants sent an email. She printed out stills of the man's face and said notices would go out to all residents in the complex. I walked back to my apartment feeling like every door I passed was suddenly thinner. That week I bought a chain lock, a door wedge, and one of those stick-on alarms that blares if someone opens the door without disarming it. I even started working from a coffee shop a few times a week, not because it was easier, just because it wasn't alone. About 3 weeks later, we got a community-wide email from the office saying police believed the same man had tried the same approach at 2 other apartment complexes nearby. No one had identified him, no license plate, no name, just security footage and a pattern. I saved the photo of his face to my phone, just in case. He never came back, or if he did, he didn't knock. Still, every now and then I'll hear a knock in the middle of the day and my body tenses before I even stand up. I check the peephole first, then the camera, then I ask through the door. I don't care if it feels rude. Not anymore. Because that man never tried to force his way in. He didn't break anything. He didn't raise his voice. He just waited for someone to believe him. And that's what still scares me the most. I never really feared the dark until the night the whole street went quiet at once. Not a flicker, not a warning. Just sudden, absolute black, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. At the time, I was living alone in a small ranch-style house on the outskirts of Spokane. The neighborhood was one of those quiet, older developments with wide lots, aging fences, and big laundry rooms built onto the back of garages. My husband and I had split a few years prior, and he'd moved to Arizona to be closer to his brother. I stayed behind. It wasn't a big house, but it was mine, and it felt enough like home that I never gave much thought to being alone. It happened in late October, about 2 weeks before Halloween. I'd worked from home most of the day, mostly answering emails and running through logistics updates for the company I contract with. That evening, I made a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and settled on the couch to watch a documentary I'd been meaning to start for weeks. The house was still just the way I liked it. Soft lighting, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the vent above the laundry room. The power cut out at 8:17 p.m. I remember the time because my phone lit up just as everything else went dark. No surge, no flicker, just silence and black. For a second, I stood there frozen, waiting to hear the beep of the microwave or the soft click of the thermostat kicking back on, but nothing happened. I walked to the front window and peeked through the blinds. The whole street was dark. No porch lights, no passing headlights, no flicker from the houses across the road. Just a flat, eerie quiet that made the air feel heavier than it had a moment before. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table. Battery was still good, but no signal. I switched on the flashlight, but it was weak and already fading. Luckily, I kept a proper flashlight in the hallway drawer, one of those chunky yellow ones you can grip with your whole hand. I clicked it on and made my way to the laundry room where the breakers were. The laundry room was always colder at night, not drafty exactly, but less insulated than the rest of the house. It smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. The flashlight beam wobbled as I stepped in and swept it across the breaker panel. Everything looked normal. No flipped switches, no visible damage. The dials were all where they should be. That's when I noticed it, a soft, pulsing glow coming from the backyard. It wasn't bright, just a faint wash of bluish light reflected on the wall through the small glass panel in the back door. I turned off the flashlight. For a moment, everything was black. Then the backyard motion light came into focus. It was a battery backup I'd had installed last year after someone tried siphoning gas from my car. It wasn't connected to the grid. It only lit up when something moved in the yard. And now, in the middle of a blackout, it was glowing steadily. I stepped slowly toward the window. The silence in the house was thick, the kind of silence that absorbs sound instead of letting it echo. I lifted one edge of the curtain and looked through the glass. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing beside the garage, not moving, not pacing, just standing completely still, half-shadowed facing the house. He wasn't holding anything. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. He looked average, medium height, average build, dark hoodie pulled up over his head, hands resting at his sides. Someone you wouldn't glance at twice in daylight, someone forgettable. But in that moment, I felt every nerve in my body react at once. I crouched down beneath the window and sat there on the cold tile flashlight off phone, still with no signal. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I thought about running to Kathy's house. She lived 2 doors down, but I remembered she was visiting her sister in Oregon. There was no one else on the block I knew well enough to turn to. I was alone. I stayed curled there for maybe 20 minutes. The light outside never flickered. The man never moved. Eventually, the battery in the motion sensor must have timed out because the light clicked off. And just like that, the glow was gone. I waited another minute, then forced myself to peek through the curtain again. He wasn't there. The yard looked exactly the way it always did. Overgrown rosebush, the old wheelbarrow leaning too far to one side, and the back fence slouched inward where the wood had softened from rain. But instead of feeling relief, I felt worse, because now I didn't know where he was. Had he circled the house? Was he still out there, just outside the reach of the light? I dragged a heavy armchair across the kitchen floor and wedged it in front of the back door. Then I sat on the hallway floor with the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, staring at the ceiling and waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I walked the house room by room. Every window was intact, front door was still bolted, but something pulled me toward the garage. I stepped out onto the back patio, cautious, quiet, and walked over to the fuse box mounted on the side wall near the AC unit. The panel was hanging open. There were tiny scratches near the edge of the metal fresh ones. Beneath the fuse box, half buried in the mulch, was a pair of wire cutters. I didn't touch them. I went back inside and waited until I had a phone signal, then called the police. A young officer arrived maybe half an hour later. His name was Officer Clean, I remember, because he looked barely older than some of the interns at my old job. He examined the fuse box and didn't say much at first. Then he nodded slightly and said, "Yeah." Someone knew what they were doing. According to him, cutting power from outside isn't hard if you know which wires to pull. He said they'd seen it before. Someone disables the house, watches for movement, and if no one comes out, that's usually the green light. He bagged the wire cutters, said they'd dust them for prints. But there were no cameras on that side of the house, and the blackout had knocked out every security system in the neighborhood, mine included. What unsettled me most was what he said before he left. There was no planned outage, he told me. No storm, no service calls. This wasn't random. Then he gave me a quiet look that stuck with me long after he drove off, like he didn't quite believe the man was there just to steal something. That week, I had the back door replaced with a reinforced model that locked from the inside without a keyhole. I installed new deadbolts, had the fuse box relocated to a less accessible spot, and adopted a big black lab mix named Moose from the local rescue shelter. I sleep better now, mostly, but I check the motion light battery twice a month. I keep the heavy flashlight right beside me at night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wake up around 2 or 3 in the morning and catch myself staring at the backyard window, waiting, wondering if that light will ever come on again. Because whoever he was that night, he knew where the fuse box was. He knew the yard layout, and he knew I was alone. I used to feel safe in my house just because it was quiet. No loud neighbors, no through traffic, just trees, porch lights, and a cul-de-sac that felt cut off from the rest of the world. Now I think quiet just makes it harder to hear when something's wrong. I was living alone in a single-story house tucked near the end of a cul-de-sac in northern Kentucky. Not remote, just quiet. The kind of neighborhood where people wave but don't really talk, where the loudest thing at night is the hum of a distant highway or the occasional dog bark down the block. I'd moved there after my divorce, not to escape anyone, just to start over somewhere that felt neutral. No shared history, no tension in the walls, just a clean slate with a fenced backyard and decent insulation. This happened in mid-October, late on a Thursday night. I'd just gotten out of the shower, hair still, damp towel around my shoulders. I was scrolling through work emails, half deciding whether to reply or leave it for morning. It was about 10 minutes before midnight. I hadn't ordered anything. I wasn't expecting a visitor. So when I heard the knock, I froze. It wasn't aggressive. 3 short raps on the front door, evenly spaced, firm, but not loud. I stood still in the hallway, just listening. The knock came again. Same pattern. Not someone lost, not someone desperate, someone waiting. I slipped on sweatpants and a t-shirt, then walked slowly toward the door. The front panel had frosted glass, just enough to make out the blur of a figure, the outline of someone holding a bag. I didn't open it. I just called through. "Can I help you?" A man's voice replied. Said he had a food delivery for someone named Brandon. His tone was neutral. Maybe a little too casual for the hour. I told him he had the wrong address. He paused, then asked if I could open the door and check the receipt. That was the moment the feeling hit me. Not panic, just a tight little knot right at the center of my chest. I said no again, firmer this time. Told him I hadn't ordered anything, and that nobody by that name lived here. He didn't argue, didn't apologize. He just stood there a few seconds longer, then knocked again. Softer, slower. Then finally walked off. I waited a full minute before looking out the window. No car, no running engine, just an empty street and the echo of that lingering knock still rattling in my nerves. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the doorbell cam app. I expected to see some guy dropping off a bag and leaving maybe a confused delivery mistake. What I saw chilled me cold. At first, it looked normal. The man was average height, maybe mid-30s. Gray hoodie pulled up ball cap underneath paper bag in one hand. He kept shifting his weight like he was thinking about what to say. But then I saw it something moving near the bottom right corner of the screen. Not the main guy, someone else. I paused the video, rewound it, then played it again, slower. There was a second man. He'd been crouched low beside the porch steps, dressed in black, completely still. Out of view from the peephole. Out of sight from the hallway window. He never stood, never spoke, just waited. At one point, his hand shifted, moving toward his jacket, then froze perfectly still again, while the man at the door kept talking. The realization sank in slow. He wasn't a lookout. He was hiding. I sat back on the couch and just stared at the still frame, the delivery bag, the cap, the crouched figure just a few feet from where I'd been standing. They hadn't knocked and run. They had waited, planned. I didn't sleep that night. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and pulled down the curtains. Sat in the living room with a baseball bat across my lap and all the lights on. Listened for movement, waited for another knock, but none came. Morning arrived like nothing had happened. Sunlight through the kitchen window. Garbage truck rolling past. Birds chirping in the neighbor's tree. The world moved on like it didn't know what nearly happened. That afternoon, I drove to the police station and asked to speak with someone. I brought the footage on a USB. The officer who took my statement was polite, a little tired, maybe like this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like it. He watched the footage quietly, then paused it right where the second man shifted into frame, let out a soft sigh through his nose, and said, "Yeah. We've been seeing more of these." He explained that sometimes it's just a tactic. One person knocks, looks harmless, friendly, the other waits for the door to open. Sometimes it's just theft. Other times, it doesn't stop there. He didn't say what those other times were. He didn't have to. Before I left, he recommended I reposition the camera to cover more of the yard and install motion lights around the porch. I did both that weekend. I also started locking the storm door, which I'd never bothered with before. It's been a year now. No repeat visits, no strange knocks. But I still think about that night. Not all the time. Just when I hear something at the door after dark, or when I check the camera and see the porch empty in black and white. The man in the hoodie never came back. Neither did the one hiding beside the steps. But it wasn't random. It wasn't a prank. And whoever they were patient. Too patient for it to be the first time. I used to think most bad things started loud. Yelling, breaking glass, screeching tires. But what scared me most didn't make any noise at all. In 2021, I rented a little one-bedroom house on the edge of Laramie, Wyoming. It wasn't much, but it was clean, affordable, and quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the mail truck coming a block away. I worked part-time at the library and spent most evenings reading on the couch with a space heater at my feet and an old fleece blanket around my shoulders. That was my peace. That was my quiet corner of the world. The sliding glass door to the backyard had been sticking for weeks. It wouldn't lock properly unless I jiggled the latch and pushed the frame with both hands at just the right angle. One night I realized it hadn't latched at all, just sitting there closed but unlocked while I'd been sleeping alone a few feet away. I made a note to get it fixed by the weekend. I posted in the local classifieds and found a guy named Teddy who said he could come by on Thursday morning. Said he had experience with doors and windows, used to do residential work, had his own tools. He showed up around 9 a.m., tall and heavy-set, maybe mid-50s, with a slight limp and a truck that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. I remember he wore a thermal shirt tucked into jeans and had a pink smudge on his cheek like insulation dust. Nothing seemed off about him, just a little slow, a little quiet. Friendly enough. He spent about an hour working on the track, said the latch was warped and needed tightening. Used a flathead screwdriver and one of those little carpenter's levels. I offered him coffee, but he said no thanks and just asked where the breaker panel was. Said he needed to test the door's auto lock. That part caught me off guard. I hadn't even known it had an auto lock. He knelt down and did something with a voltage tester near the bottom corner. I didn't watch too closely, just assumed he knew what he was doing. When he was finished, the door slid smooth as butter, locked perfectly. No more jiggling. I thanked him and paid in cash $40. He said if I had any more issues to just give him a call. I didn't plan to. That night I went about my usual routine. Reheated soup, read a few chapters of a mystery novel, turned off the porch light. I locked the front door and tested the sliding glass just to make sure. Clicked tight, no wiggle. I slept soundly, or at least I thought I did, until just after 2:00 a.m., when I woke up feeling cold. It wasn't freezing, just noticeably cooler than it should have been. I sat up and saw that the curtain over the sliding door was moving slightly, like a breeze was coming in. My first thought was that I'd left a window cracked, but as I stood, I realized the curtain wasn't billowing. It was swaying as if it had just been touched. I flipped on the lamp and crossed to the door. It looked closed, still latched, but something was off. I pressed my hand to the glass. It felt wrong, not cold like it should have been. Room temperature. I opened the curtain fully and leaned in close. The lock was still in the closed position, but the door wasn't seated in the track properly. Just barely off, not enough to see at a glance, but enough to notice if you knew how it should sit. The rubber seal along the edge was slightly bowed, like it had been forced open and pushed back. I ran my fingers along the latch. It clicked when I pressed it, meaning it had been open, even though it looked shut. I backed away slowly and turned on every light in the house. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But something wasn't right. I didn't call the police at first. I couldn't explain what they'd be investigating an unlocked door. A gut feeling. I stayed awake the rest of the night, drinking tea and listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the house settling. Every time I looked toward the sliding door, it felt like something was on the other side, waiting, measuring the silence. The next morning I checked the backyard. No prints in the snow, no signs of anyone walking through the gate. I almost let it go, almost convinced myself I was overreacting. But before I left for work, I wedged a wooden rod into the track so the door couldn't slide no matter what. That night, just before midnight, I was reading on the couch again when I heard it. A soft, metallic click. Not a knock, not footsteps, just a quiet shift in the door's frame, like someone had tried the latch. I froze, waited, then heard it again, not louder, just slower. Click, pause, click. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house. It was deliberate. I turned off the lamp and stepped back into the hallway. My phone was in the kitchen. I grabbed it and called the non-emergency number. The dispatcher asked if anyone was trying to force entry. I said I didn't know, just that someone had worked on the door that morning, and now it felt like they were testing it. The deputy arrived 10 minutes later. By then, the noise had stopped. He checked the yard with a flashlight, circled the house, then knocked gently before coming in. His name was Officer Klein, a younger guy, probably just out of academy. He took my statement and walked over to inspect the sliding door. That's when he found it. There was a slim piece of foil tape folded under the outer edge of the latch. The kind used in electrical work, easy to miss, but just thick enough to prevent the lock from engaging fully. Whoever put it there had done it carefully, precisely. Officer Klein peeled it off and held it up to the light. Didn't say anything for a moment, then finally asked if the handyman had worked alone. I said yes. He nodded slowly and said, "You should probably get that lock replaced completely, just in case." I filed a report, gave the name and number Teddy had used on Craigslist, but the number was already out of service. No last name, no license plate, nothing traceable. I bought a new lock the next day, replaced the entire door a week later, and started keeping a piece of masking tape over the inside latch so I could always tell if it had been touched. I don't know if he ever came back, if he sat in that backyard waiting to see if I noticed, if he was watching from somewhere when the police showed up, or if the whole thing was just a test, a dry run for someone who'd done it before. I just know that sometimes people don't break in with force. Sometimes they wait, they study, they leave the door open just enough and come back later to see if you've realized. I was 17 the first time I stayed home alone overnight. My aunt had to drive out to her sister's place across the state, and I told her I'd be fine. We both thought I would be. My mom passed away when I was 15, and after that I moved in with my Aunt Melody. She was my mom's younger sister, a practical woman who worked early shifts and didn't hover. We lived in a rented farmhouse outside Millersburg, Indiana, about a mile off the main road. The house sat next to a soybean field, with a long gravel driveway and a rotary-style landline phone mounted to the kitchen wall more out of habit than necessity. Cell service was spotty at best. That fall, Aunt Melody needed to leave for a weekend to help her older sister after a surgery. She asked if I'd be okay by myself. I said yes. I was proud of how independent I'd become, made my own dinner, didn't get scared easily, kept the doors locked. The house creaked sometimes, especially when the wind came from the east, but I was used to it. The first night alone, I microwaved leftover chili, watched a movie, and went to bed around 10. It was quiet outside, windless with no frogs or crickets, which I only noticed because the silence made the refrigerator hum seem louder than usual. I woke sometime after 2:00 a.m. to a strange sound echoing down the hall. At first, I thought it was the smoke alarm chirping low battery, but when I listened more closely, I realized it was the kitchen phone ringing. Just one short mechanical trill. Then, nothing. No second ring, no message, no caller ID glow, just that one sharp tone. I got up and checked it. The phone was mounted to the wall, same as always. But I realized something strange. The cord had been pulled from the jack. It wasn't plugged in. The base light was off. Dead. I stood there holding the receiver for a few seconds, not even sure what to think. Maybe it had stored some residual energy. Maybe the wind or vibration had triggered it. I didn't know how phones worked well enough to guess. I went back to bed, but left the bedroom door open and the hallway light on. The next night, it happened again. This time at exactly 2:17 a.m. One shrill ring, then silence. I was already awake when it happened, staring at the ceiling, half dreading, half hoping it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. I checked again. The phone was still unplugged, completely inert. I even tried plugging it back in to check the line, but there was no dial tone, nothing. I texted Aunt Melody, but I didn't want to worry her, so I left out the timing. Just said I heard the phone click and wondered if she'd tried to call the landline. She said she hadn't. That Sunday, I walked into town and stopped by the sheriff's office to speak with the on-duty deputy. His name was Officer Weller, and he treated my concern kindly, if a little skeptically. I asked if it was possible for a phone to ring, even if it wasn't plugged in. He scratched his head and said maybe if there was power fluctuation or a lightning surge, but we hadn't had storms. Then he asked something strange. "Is that the old Harker place?" I said yes. He paused and said, "We used to get noise complaints out there, back when the previous tenant lived alone." I asked what kind of noise. He said people kept reporting a phone ringing through the night. Only problem was the tenant swore he didn't own one. That was enough to make my hands feel cold. I stayed one more night before Aunt Melody came back. I didn't tell her everything until weeks later, not until after I'd woken one last time, just before 2:00 a.m., and stood in the hallway waiting for the sound. But there was nothing, just empty silence. I turned toward the kitchen and saw the receiver dangling off the hook, not swinging, just hanging still. The cord hadn't been that way when I went to bed. I walked over slowly, picked it up, set it back. Then I unplugged the phone completely, not just from the jack from the wall. That phone never rang again. But I never forgot the sound, that crisp, bright trill like a demand, and it still makes my skin crawl when I hear it in movies or old recordings. It wasn't a voice, wasn't a ghost, but something wanted attention, and it knew just how to ask for it. That was the last one I'll share tonight. Thinking back on these stories, the gas stations and motels, the snowy roads and quiet houses, I keep wondering what they all have in common. They weren't about monsters, not really. They were about noticing something small, something off, and how sometimes the quietest signs are the most important. A soft knock when no one should be there, a flickering light at the wrong hour, a door that doesn't quite shut all the way. These stories all came from different places, but they leave the same feeling behind, that cold knot in your stomach when something's just not right and no one else sees it. The world keeps moving like everything's fine, but you know something is just under the surface. Watching, listening, waiting. And it's never loud. It doesn't need to be. It just waits until you're alone, until your guard is down, until you think it's over, and then it starts again. Maybe you've felt that before. Maybe something in these stories reminded you of a place you stayed, or a night you'd rather forget. If so, I hope you know you're not the only one. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories stayed with you, consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who likes quiet, eerie tales before bed. I'd love to hear from you too. Have you ever heard a sound in your home that no one could explain? Sleep well tonight. And remember, the silence isn't always empty.